Medieval Nightmare, the true story of Henry VIII's 400-pound body and its horrific decline. In the shadowed corridors of Greenwich Palace, servants whispered of a horror that walked amongst them. Not a ghost or demon from medieval folklore, but something far more terrifying. A living king whose body had become a grotesque prison of flesh and decay. The year was 1546, and Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of England, had transformed into a 400-pound nightmare that haunted his own kingdom. The stench reached them first, that sickly sweet odor of rotting meat mixed with expensive perfumes, announcing the royal presence long before the mechanical contraptions grinding across stone floors became audible. Courtiers would press scented handkerchiefs to their faces, not in delicate feminine fashion, but in desperate attempts to avoid retching before their sovereign. Some claimed you could smell the king from 3 rooms away on a still day. But the smell was merely the beginning of the horror. When Henry VIII finally appeared, carried on his specially constructed chair with wheels and pulleys, witnesses beheld something that defied the very notion of divine kingship. His legs, swollen to tree-trunk proportions, were wrapped in blood-stained bandages that could never quite contain the yellow-green pus that seeped continuously from wounds that had festered for over a decade. His face, once handsome enough to charm 6 wives, had become a bloated moon of flesh, his small eyes nearly lost in folds of fat that shifted and rippled with each labored breath. This was no longer the athletic young monarch who had once jousted with the finest knights in Europe, who had danced until dawn and composed music that stirred hearts across his realm. This was something else entirely, a creature born from unchecked power, paranoid rage, and appetites so massive they had literally consumed their host from within. The transformation had been so complete, so utterly horrifying, that foreign ambassadors wrote home describing not a king, but a beast in the shape of a man. Yet perhaps the most terrifying aspect was not what Henry had become, but what he still wielded. Despite his monstrous appearance, despite the fact that servants drew lots to determine who would have to dress him, despite the reality that his own body was killing him one putrid day at a time, this creature still held absolute power over the lives and deaths of millions. And he used that power with the casual cruelty of someone who had forgotten that other people were human beings rather than toys to be broken at will. Chapter 1. The Anatomy of a Royal Catastrophe. The transformation of Henry VIII from Renaissance prince to medieval nightmare began not with his infamous marriages or religious reforms, but with his body. A vessel that would ultimately become both his prison and his weapon of terror against those unlucky enough to serve him. By 1546, the king's weight had ballooned to an estimated 400 pounds, distributed across a frame that stood just under 6 feet tall. To comprehend the sheer mass of the man, consider that his armor, specially crafted in his final years, required a chest measurement of 58 inches and a waist of 54 inches. For context, that waist measurement exceeds the height of many adults. The armor itself weighed over 90 pounds, more than many full-grown women, and required a complex system of pulleys and mechanical assistance simply to position it on the king's body. But raw weight told only part of the horrifying story. Henry's legs had become the stuff of nightmares, swollen to such enormous proportions that they resembled the twisted trunks of ancient oaks more than human limbs. The skin, stretched beyond all natural limits, had developed a disturbing translucent quality that allowed observers to see the network of burst blood vessels beneath. More horrifying still were the ulcers, massive, weeping wounds that had opened across both legs and refused to heal despite the desperate ministrations of the finest physicians in Europe. These were not simple sores. Medical experts today believe Henry suffered from venous insufficiency combined with possible diabetes, creating wounds that would split open at the slightest movement, releasing torrents of infected fluid that soaked through multiple layers of bandages within hours. The smell emanating from these wounds defied description. Contemporary accounts speak of a putrid sweetness that lingered in rooms long after the king had departed. Dr. William Butts, Henry's personal physician, left coded notes describing the challenge of treating a patient whose very presence could induce vomiting in medical attendants. The wounds required daily cleaning, a task so revolting that servants literally drew straws to determine who would perform the duty. Those chosen would arrive armed with pomanders filled with the strongest herbs available, breathing only through their mouths while racing to complete their work before succumbing to nausea. The king's mobility had become a grotesque spectacle in itself. Unable to walk more than a few steps without excruciating pain, Henry required a specially designed chair fitted with wheels and operated by a complex series of ropes and pulleys. The device, more medieval siege engine than furniture, required 4 strong men to operate and produced a grinding mechanical symphony that announced the royal presence throughout the palace. The sound struck terror into servants' hearts, not out of reverence, but from the knowledge that the approaching horror would likely demand something impossible or execute someone for an imagined slight. Even more disturbing was the king's denial of his condition. Despite requiring mechanical assistance to move, despite the constant leakage from his wounds, despite weighing more than 2 average men combined, Henry continued to insist on his physical prowess. He would challenge courtiers to activities he could no longer perform, becoming violently enraged when they tactfully declined or when his own body betrayed him in the attempt. The psychological impact on those around him was profound. Servants developed what we might now recognize as trauma responses, jumping at unexpected sounds, breaking into cold sweats when summoned to attend the king, and experiencing nightmares about the smell and sight of their sovereign's deteriorating form. Some requested transfers to the remotest estates in England, preferring exile to daily exposure to their monarch's physical horror. Perhaps most tragically, Henry's condition created a feedback loop of misery that made everyone around him complicit in his suffering. His physicians, terrified of suggesting that the divine king might be seriously ill, prescribed increasingly exotic and painful treatments. His servants, afraid to appear disgusted by his condition, had to maintain expressions of respectful attention while secretly fighting waves of nausea. His courtiers were forced to pretend that the shuffling, reeking mechanical contraption before them was still the glorious king they had once served. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Fear. Henry VIII's paranoia had metastasized alongside his physical decay, transforming every royal residence into an elaborate prison, designed as much to contain the king's fears as to protect his person. By the 1540s, no palace in England was safe from the mechanical excavations and architectural modifications demanded by a monarch, convinced that assassins lurked behind every tapestry and poison waited in every goblet. The king's sleeping arrangements had evolved into something resembling a military encampment within his own bedchamber. Henry slept surrounded by an arsenal, that would have made a medieval knight envious, multiple loaded crossbows positioned within arm's reach, an array of daggers hidden beneath his pillows, and a sword mounted on a special bracket beside his bed. But weapons were merely the beginning of his nocturnal defenses. The royal bed itself had been modified into a fortress. Thick curtains, far heavier than required for privacy or warmth, could be quickly drawn to create an enclosed space that would slow potential attackers. Hidden within the bed frame were additional compartments containing emergency supplies, food, water, and medicine, in case the king found himself under siege in his own chambers. Most unnervingly, Henry had ordered the installation of a special bell system that could summon armed guards from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a cacophony of alarm that could wake the entire palace. Sleep brought no peace to the tormented king. Guards were required to maintain watch throughout the night, standing in designated positions where they could observe the royal slumber without being able to approach undetected. These sentries worked in shifts, as the assignment was considered so stressful that men would begin to hallucinate after extended periods of watching the massive, wheezing form of their sovereign struggle with his nightmares. But Henry's paranoia extended far beyond personal protection. He had commissioned a network of secret passages throughout his residences, passages known only to him and a handful of trusted architects, most of whom were quietly executed after construction to ensure their silence. These hidden corridors allowed the king to move unseen through his own palaces, eavesdropping on conversations and observing his subjects without their knowledge. The spy network Henry created was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He employed informants to watch his informants, creating layers of surveillance so complex that nobody could be certain who was truly loyal and who was reporting their every word to the throne. Servants would discover that private conversations held in supposedly secure locations had been overheard and reported, leading to an atmosphere of suffocating suspicion where even married couples hesitated to speak freely in their own chambers. Food presented the greatest challenge to Henry's paranoid mind. The king's meals had become elaborate theatrical productions involving dozens of participants in a carefully choreographed dance of distrust. Each dish required tasting by multiple individuals, not just one or two, but entire chains of tasters, each waiting specified intervals to ensure that any potential poison would have time to take effect before the food reached the royal lips. The process began in the kitchens, where special guards watched the preparation of every ingredient. Cooks worked under constant supervision, their every movement observed and recorded. Salt, spices, even water had to be tested by designated individuals whose sole responsibility was to sample specific components of royal meals. The testing hierarchy was so complex that charts were required to track which person was responsible for which element of each dish. But the king's paranoia reached truly disturbing levels in his treatment of those closest to him. Henry maintained detailed files on his own family members, treating his daughters Mary and Elizabeth as potential threats to be monitored rather than children to be protected. He had ordered surveillance of their activities, their correspondence, even their religious observances, convinced that they were plotting against him despite their youth and obvious terror of his displeasure. The psychological toll on the court was immeasurable. Nobles who had once competed for the honor of serving close to the throne now sought assignments that would keep them far from the royal presence. The constant surveillance, the unpredictable rages, the knowledge that a single misinterpreted word could result in execution, all combined to create an environment of such intense stress that courtiers developed physical symptoms of anxiety. Some began to experience what we might now recognize as panic attacks when summoned to audience with the king. Others reported insomnia, unable to sleep in a palace where they knew hidden eyes might be watching their every movement. A few requested permission to retire to their country estates, claiming illness or family obligations, rather than admitting their terror of remaining near their increasingly unstable sovereign. Chapter 3. The Theatre of Marital Cruelty. The private chambers of Henry VIII had become a stage for psychological tortures that would have impressed the most creative minds of the Spanish Inquisition. What the world knew as the king's great matter, his serial marriages and divorces, was behind palace doors a methodical campaign of domestic terrorism that destroyed not just his wives, but their entire families and anyone unlucky enough to witness his private cruelties. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, endured perhaps the most prolonged psychological warfare. After 20 years of marriage, Henry didn't simply divorce her. He orchestrated a campaign of emotional destruction that lasted for years. He banned her from court, separated her from their daughter Mary, and spread rumors that she was mentally unstable. But the private humiliations were worse than any public disgrace. Henry would summon Catherine to private meetings where he would alternate between declarations of love and threats of execution. He would present her with legal documents demanding she acknowledge their marriage had never been valid, then fly into violent rages when she refused to sign. During these encounters, witnesses reported, Henry would pace around his immobilized wife like a predator, his massive bulk creating an atmosphere of physical menace that made his words seem almost gentle by comparison. The psychological games reached depths of cruelty that defied comprehension. Henry would send Catherine gifts, jewelry, books, religious items, along with letters expressing his continued affection. Then days later, he would have those same items confiscated and destroyed, often in front of her, while explaining that she had no right to accept presents from a king to whom she was not married. Anne Boleyn's treatment revealed Henry's capacity for orchestrating elaborate psychological torture. Before her execution, he didn't simply order her death. He crafted a scenario designed to maximize her suffering and humiliation. He forced her to watch as 5 men, including her own brother George, were executed on charges of adultery with her. Anne was compelled to observe these murders from a palace window, knowing that she would face the same fate and that these men were dying because of accusations she knew to be false. But Henry's cruelty extended beyond the executions themselves. In the days leading up to Anne's death, he would send servants to her prison cell with updates on the preparations for her execution, descriptions of the specially commissioned French sword, details about the scaffold construction, even information about who would be allowed to witness her death. These weren't practical communications, but deliberate psychological torture designed to ensure that Anne spent her final days in maximum terror. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, was little more than a teenager when she became the target of his domestic sadism. When Henry discovered her previous romantic relationships, he didn't simply order her execution. He systematically destroyed her entire world. He had her childhood friends tortured until they provided testimony against her, forced her family members to denounce her publicly, and created a legal framework that made her past relationships retroactively treasonous. The private interrogations of Catherine Howard revealed Henry's talent for psychological manipulation. He would summon the terrified young woman to his chambers, where his physical presence 400 pounds of diseased flesh wrapped in royal robes created an atmosphere of overwhelming menace. He would speak softly, almost gently, asking detailed questions about her relationships while making it clear that the wrong answer would result in immediate execution. Henry's treatment of Jane Seymour demonstrated that even death couldn't protect his wives from his cruelty. When Jane died from complications following childbirth, Henry immediately began planning his next marriage while her body was still warm. He ordered that Jane's personal belongings be distributed among his courtiers as gifts, erasing all traces of her existence from the palace within days of her funeral. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henry's domestic cruelty was how he forced his wives' families and friends to participate in their destruction. He required Catherine of Aragon's own relatives to testify that she had been mentally unstable throughout their marriage. He compelled Anne Boleyn's father to sit in judgment at her trial and vote for her execution. He made Catherine Howard's family members publicly celebrate her death as necessary for the good of the realm. The king's wives weren't simply victims. They were unwilling participants in theatrical productions designed to demonstrate Henry's absolute power over life and death. He would force them to smile and appear happy during public appearances while privately threatening their lives if they showed any sign of distress. They had to perform gratitude for his attention while knowing that his favor could turn to murderous rage without warning. The servants who witnessed these private scenes were sworn to secrecy under pain of death, but their testimony, recorded years later, reveals the true scope of Henry's domestic terrorism. They described a king who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the fear in his wives' eyes, who would prolong their psychological suffering far beyond what was necessary to achieve his political goals, and who treated the destruction of human beings as entertainment for his private amusement. Chapter 4. Gluttony as Performance Art. The royal dining hall of Henry VIII had evolved into something between a Roman amphitheater and a medical horror show, where the king's consumption of food became a daily spectacle that simultaneously fascinated and revolted hundreds of observers. By the 1540s, Henry's eating habits had transcended mere gluttony to become elaborate theatrical performances that showcased both his immense wealth and his complete surrender to physical appetites that were literally consuming him from within. A typical meal for Henry VIII represented more food than most noble families would consume in a week. The royal kitchens, employing over 200 staff working in shifts throughout the day and night, would prepare an average of 13 courses containing more than 800 individual dishes. Henry wouldn't eat all of these. Such consumption would have been physically impossible even for his expanded stomach, but he required the visual abundance as a demonstration of his power to command the resources of an entire kingdom for his personal pleasure. The king's daily caloric intake was estimated at over 5,000 calories, more than twice what an active adult male should consume, distributed across meals that began before dawn and continued until late evening. But the sheer quantity paled beside the theatrical nature of the consumption. Henry ate in full view of his court, transforming basic nutrition into a performance that could last up to 4 hours and require the attendance of hundreds of observers. The process began with an elaborate ritual of food testing that had evolved far beyond practical poison detection into a complex ceremony of paranoia and power display. Each dish required tasting by multiple servants arranged in careful hierarchies. First the kitchen staff, then junior courtiers, then senior nobles with specific waiting periods between each tasting to ensure that any potential poison would have time to take effect. The testing ceremony alone could consume an hour before the king took his first bite. Henry's physical condition made eating a grotesque spectacle that his observers were required to witness without showing disgust. The king's massive bulk, confined within specially reinforced chairs that groaned under his weight, created an atmosphere of barely contained disaster. His breathing, labored from the mere effort of existing at 400 pounds, became even more strained during meals, producing wheezing sounds that echoed throughout the dining hall. The smell emanating from the king's infected leg wounds intensified during eating, as the physical exertion of consuming massive quantities of food seemed to aggravate the seepage from his ulcers. Courtiers reported that the combination of rotting flesh and rich food created an olfactory nightmare that made many observers physically ill, though they were required to maintain expressions of respectful attention throughout the meal. Henry's eating habits revealed a man who had lost all connection between physical appetite and emotional satisfaction. He would consume entire roasted fowl in minutes, tearing meat from bones with his bare hands while grease ran down his arms and soaked into his clothing. He devoured massive joints of beef, whole fish, and loaves of bread in succession, pausing only to gulp wine from goblets that required frequent refilling. But perhaps most disturbing was the king's insistence that others participate in his gluttony. He would force courtiers to match his consumption, becoming violently angry when they claimed to be full or showed signs of nausea. He particularly enjoyed compelling smaller or older nobles to attempt to keep pace with his eating, seeming to derive pleasure from watching them struggle with quantities of food that made them physically ill. The king had developed bizarre superstitions about food that revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration. He believed that consuming swan would make him more graceful, despite his inability to walk without mechanical assistance. He was convinced that eating massive quantities of venison would improve his hunting abilities, though he could no longer mount a horse. Most absurdly, he maintained that consuming oysters by the dozen would enhance his performance with his wives, apparently oblivious to the fact that his physical condition made him incapable of normal intimacy. The kitchen staff lived in constant terror of failing to satisfy the king's impossible demands. Henry would order dishes from different regions of England simultaneously, requiring his cooks to prepare Yorkshire pudding, Cornish pasties, and Scottish haggis for the same meal. He would demand foods that were out of season, threatening execution when his staff explained that certain ingredients were simply unavailable. He once ordered the execution of a cook who failed to prepare a dish exactly as Henry remembered eating it 20 years earlier, apparently forgetting that his tastes had been dramatically altered by his deteriorating health. The cost of Henry's eating habits was bankrupting the royal treasury. The daily expense of feeding the king exceeded the annual income of many noble estates. Special ships were required to import exotic delicacies from across Europe, while teams of hunters worked constantly to supply the massive quantities of game meat the king consumed. The royal kitchens consumed more fuel than many entire villages, burning continuously to keep pace with Henry's demands for fresh, hot food at any hour of the day or night. Chapter 5. The final grotesque spectacle. The death of Henry VIII was not the dignified passing of a monarch, but a horrific finale that turned the very process of royal mortality into a nightmare that haunted everyone unfortunate enough to witness it. By January 1547, the king's body had become such a grotesque parody of human form that his final weeks resembled less a royal deathbed scene than a medieval morality play about the wages of unchecked appetite and absolute power. Henry's mobility had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer be moved without risk of his infected wounds splitting open and releasing torrents of putrid fluid. The specially designed chair that had carried him for years proved inadequate for his final condition, requiring the construction of an even more elaborate contraption that resembled a medieval siege engine more than furniture. This final conveyance required 6 men to operate and produced mechanical grinding sounds audible throughout the palace, announcing the approach of the dying king like some awful clockwork harbinger of doom. The smell had become unbearable even by the standards of those who had endured years of the king's deteriorating condition. The infected ulcers on Henry's legs had developed into gaping wounds that wept continuously, while his massive body had begun the process of decomposition before death had technically occurred. Servants reported that the stench could be detected from adjoining rooms, and that even the strongest perfumes and incenses could not mask the odor of a body consuming itself from within. Henry's mental state during his final weeks revealed a man completely divorced from reality. Despite being unable to walk, barely able to speak above a whisper, and requiring constant medical attention to prevent his wounds from becoming completely gangrenous, he continued to make plans for military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives. He would dictate letters to foreign monarchs describing hunting expeditions he could no longer undertake and martial prowess he had lost years earlier. The king's physicians found themselves in an impossible position. Henry's condition clearly required immediate medical intervention that might have prolonged his life, but suggesting that the divine king was seriously ill constituted treason. Dr. William Butts, his personal physician, left coded notes describing his frustration at being required to treat symptoms while being forbidden to acknowledge the underlying disease. The medical staff were reduced to changing bandages and applying ineffective salves to wounds that required surgical intervention they dared not suggest. Henry's paranoia reached its final crescendo during his last days. Unable to move without assistance, he became convinced that his attendants were plotting to smother him in his sleep. He demanded that guards be positioned where he could see them at all times, creating a deathbed scene that resembled a military encampment more than a royal chamber. Even his closest advisors were required to approach his bed with hands visible and movements slow, lest they be mistaken for assassins. The actual moment of death was mercifully brief compared to the extended horror of his final illness. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died in his sleep, his massive bulk finally succumbing to the multiple infections and complications that had been consuming him for years. But death brought no dignity to the proceedings. If anything, it made the situation worse. The king's body continued to deteriorate rapidly after death, swelling with gases produced by accelerated decomposition. The corpse became so distended that normal burial preparations proved impossible. The royal embalmers, experienced in preserving noble remains, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the challenge of preparing Henry's massive infected body for its final journey to Windsor Castle. The solution was to wrap the corpse in lead sheeting and seal it within multiple wooden coffins, creating what amounted to a royal sarcophagus designed more to contain the horror within than to honor the king's memory. Even these precautions proved inadequate. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor, the combination of the corpse's weight and the gases produced by continued decomposition caused the coffin to split open, releasing fluids and remains onto the floor of the funeral carriage. The cleanup required emergency intervention by servants who had to scrape royal remains from the carriage while the funeral procession waited. Contemporary accounts describe the smell as so overwhelming that horses shied away from the funeral carriage, and members of the procession were observed vomiting along the roadside. Some witnesses claimed that dogs were later seen in the area, apparently attracted by the scent of decay that had marked the king's final journey. The burial itself became a final demonstration of how completely Henry's physical reality had overwhelmed any pretense of royal dignity. The grave had to be excavated to unusual dimensions to accommodate the massive coffin, and additional support structures were required to prevent the ground from collapsing under the weight of lead and decomposing flesh. Even after burial, reports persisted of strange sounds and odors emanating from the royal tomb, suggesting that Henry's remains continued to cause disturbances long after his official interment. Conclusion: the monster's legacy. Henry VIII died as he had lived in his final years, as a grotesque monument to the corruption that absolute power could inflict upon both body and soul. The king who had once embodied the Renaissance ideal of monarchy had become something that defied not only human dignity, but human recognition itself. His 400-pound corpse, leaking fluids through lead-lined coffins, provided a perfect metaphor for a reign that had consumed everything it touched. The horror of Henry's physical decline was matched only by the psychological devastation he inflicted on everyone around him. His wives, his children, his servants, his courtiers, all had been warped by proximity to a man whose appetites had grown so monstrous that they devoured not just his own body, but the humanity of his entire kingdom. The England that survived Henry VIII was a nation traumatized, a realm that had learned to live with the constant possibility of arbitrary violence and irrational demands from its sovereign. Perhaps most tragically, Henry's grotesque end revealed the ultimate futility of absolute power. All his paranoid security measures, all his mechanical contraptions, all his surveillance networks and food tasters and hidden passages, none of it could protect him from the enemy that ultimately destroyed him: his own unchecked appetites. The king, who claimed divine authority over millions of lives, couldn't even control his own physical existence. His body became both his prison and his legacy, a rotting testament to what happens when human desires are freed from all restraint and consequence. The true horror of Henry VIII wasn't just what he became, but what he revealed about the nature of power itself. That authority without accountability inevitably transforms its wielder into something monstrous, something that destroys not just its enemies, but everything it claims to protect and serve.